Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. We're very excited about tonight's talk. Before I introduce Professor Costigliola, I would like to mention a couple of upcoming programs. Since I gather that you are all interested in history, I do want to point out that tomorrow night at the Plaza Library, we have Fred Kaplan, an award-winning biographer of Carlyle, Twain, James, Dickens. I better stop there. I could name the people he hasn't written biographies of faster than those he has. With his John Quincy Adams biography, it's co-sponsored with the Truman Library as part of our Hail to the Chiefs series. It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times a couple of weekends ago, and we're really looking forward to that. Please join us. Again, since you're interested in history, we have a couple of battles that we're going to be celebrating. The most important battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Westport. Thank you for that. Daniel Smith will be here at Central Library as part of our Missouri Valley Sundays, our local history series, talking about General Sterling Price, the general, not the cat, from True Grit. For those of you who've seen True Grit, there is a cat named Sterling Price, sorry. And then last but not least, on Tuesday, June 24th, Tony Mullis from the Command School at Fort Leavenworth, our ongoing partner, will be talking on the 700th anniversary. We do anniversaries well, don't we? About the Battle of Bannockburn. That's not only the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, but shortly before the Scots will vote on whether or not to once again be an independent and poor country. Small editorial comment. Thank you. And also, I would like to point out Tom Platt, the head of our Friends of the Library, is out there passing goodies out, and for a very small fee, you can become a member of one of the most exclusive groups in the United States, the Friends of the Kansas City Public Library. We need the money, we need the help, we need the advocacy, so if you're not a member, please join. Tom would be happy to have you out there. If I can find my actual introduction, it'd be good. Professor Costigliola, Frank Costigliola, is a PhD from Cornell, a professor at the University of Connecticut, and has written a number of books about the Cold War, about America and her allies, sometime allies, France and the Europeans generally. In a piece that he wrote, an op-ed piece that he wrote recently in the New York Times in February, he quoted President Obama in his recent interview with David Remnick in the New Yorker, where he said, "I don't really even need George Kennan right now." And Professor Costigliola said, "Obama got it wrong." In George Kennan's remarkable diaries, ably edited by Professor Costigliola, we learn in 2001, towards the end of George Kennan's life, that Kennan himself says of George W. Bush that he got it wrong. I quote, "I will not worry further about the multiple unnecessary and grave dangers into which Mr. Bush has so lightheartedly been bringing us." It is clear from these diaries that the apostle of containment during the Cold War, author of the long telegram from which many believe the dawn of the Cold War came, spent his 50-year retirement after leaving the State Department, becoming, as he said about Afghanistan, also towards the end of his life and the end of these diaries, becoming more of an isolationist than ever. Isolationist, of course, isn't quite right, because what Costigliola is, as a brilliant editor of this diary shows, is that he was a skeptic, ready to warn us about our hubris, a great observer and analyst, who could see beyond the immediate crisis and not give in to unnatural fears or triumphalism. It could also be said of him that containment was the policy of one who is sometimes more of an observer than a diplomat. There is a pattern of engagement and retreat in his life. In fact, he says, as he's leaving the State Department, he writes himself a memo about what he might do. And he says, teaching would be very difficult. Of course, he ended up teaching most of the rest of his life. Teaching would be very difficult, particularly in the United States. It would require too much of an intellectual exchange with other people. There is this quality of retreat into sometimes vanity and self-absorption, which is revealed in these diaries and explicated by Professor Costigliola. But also one has to say, oh, what a writer he was. So I have to just read this passage. I hope I'm not stepping on the professor's toes here with this, but he goes out to California just before not long before he retires. And this is how he begins his diary entry about that. My thoughts are full of this Southern California world I see below me and about me. It is easy to ridicule it, as Aldous Huxley and so many other intellectuals have done, but it is silly and a form of self-condemnation to do so. Now I skip a couple of paragraphs to a more detailed observation about California. Let me try to get at it by overstating it. Here it is easy to see that when man is given, as he can be given only for relatively brief periods, in exceptional circumstances, freedom both from political restraint and from want, the effect is to render him childlike in many respects, fun-loving, quick to laughter and enthusiasm, unanalytical, unintellectual, outwardly expansive, preoccupied with physical beauty and prowess, given to sudden and unthinking seizures of aggressiveness, driven consistently to protect his status in the group by an eager conformism, yet not unhappy. In this sense, Southern California, together with all that tendency of American life which it typifies, is childhood without the promise of maturity. Well, totally self-contradictory, but oh God, what a writer he was, and it's brilliantly revealed in this biography. I also want to mention that at the beginning of the book is one of the most thoughtful editorial ideas that I've ever seen in a book like this. There is this section right at the beginning where Professor Costigliola quotes Kennan from throughout the diaries, from various places in the diaries, about all the places that he lived and the beautiful descriptions. And it's true of George Kennan, and I think must be true of Frank Costigliola, that he had a sense of place which is so important to a great sense of history, and we're very glad that Frank Costigliola is in this place tonight. But I do have to say one more thing, and that is about another great historian. This series is sponsored by Adam Starr. Our friend Adam Starr, and some of you will know that from the sponsorship of our last lecture in the Starr series, Jonathan Steinberg and his Karl Marx biography, which was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize this past year. And Adam just graduated from Pembroke, a school of higher learning here in Kansas City, and is about to take off to become the chairman of the history department at Pomona College in California. They need help there, and we decided to send Adam there to help them, California, with their obvious problems, as you can see from George Kennan. And we are really grateful to Adam and to his family for sponsoring this lecture series, but especially to Adam for having such a great sense of history himself, such a great sense of place. He's decided to keep the lecture series here and not take it to California with him, and such a great sense of great historians as to bring Frank Costigliola to us. Adam, thank you. Professor Costigliola, thank you.
Well, thank you, Crosby, for that introduction, which is really very appropriate. Actually, you've said half the things, or you've introduced half the things that I want to talk about. No, and I mean that as very positively. First, I want to thank Crosby Kemper, Henry Fortunato, Todd Boyer, and the rest of the Kansas City Public Library staff for inviting me here and for setting up this wonderful venue. So, Yeah, I think it's very appropriate. The time and the place is appropriate time and place, as Crosby said, to talk about George Kennan and his diaries. First of all, George Kennan was a Midwesterner, very proud of being a Midwesterner. He grew up in Milwaukee, and he was very conscious of the fact that Milwaukee was not California. It's also appropriate, this place is very appropriate to talk about Kennan because Kennan's most productive years in the government was as a member of the Truman administration. And of course, Harry Truman was born and grew up just about 40 miles from here in Independence, Missouri. Notice I said Missouri, I'm trying to win the audience here. And also, finally, two things in terms of place. Also, it's appropriate for me to talk about Kennan here because Adam Starr, who's the sponsor of this event, has himself written and published a piece on George Kennan. And I had lunch with Adam today, and I learned quite a bit. So that's very much appropriate. And finally, in terms of place, I mean, I think it's certainly appropriate for me to be talking about Kennan today because you're going to be listening to the person who wrote the biography of John Quincy Adams tomorrow. And Kennan was a very strong admirer of John Quincy Adams. And in Kennan's quite famous television hearing, he was on J. William Fulbright's televised hearing regarding the Vietnam War. And Kennan was one of the first articulate member of the establishment to speak out against the Vietnam War. This was in February 1966, and Kennan finished his testimony, which got a standing ovation from the Congressional Committee. Kennan finished his testimony by quoting from John Quincy Adams. So it is certainly very appropriate. And in terms of time here in 2014, to be talking about George Kennan, one thing that really strikes me about Kennan's writings, the diary and his other writings, is the continuing relevance of what Kennan had to say about American foreign policy, the continuing relevance even today, 9 years after his death. And I think you'll see some of that in some of the entries that I'll be reading. Okay. Most of my talk this evening will consist of the actual words of Kennan, who was far more eloquent than I could ever hope to be. But I want to start off with some introductory material to place Kennan and his diary in context. In terms of his career, Kennan, or his life story, Kennan, as I said, grew up in Milwaukee. He went off to Princeton University, graduated in 1925, and then he entered the Foreign Service. He became a Foreign Service officer from 1926 to 1952 or 53. He basically got fired in 52, 53, and I can talk about that story if you want, but his career lasted down to 1953. After he left the State Department, as Crosby said, he went and he became a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where he became an historian, even though he didn't have any formal training as an historian, and wrote 20 books. 20 books, including several books which won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, the Bancroft Prize, and virtually every other prize available. As Kennan once said, he had not won the Nobel Prize, but that might be coming the following year. It never did come. Okay. So here's Kennan as the writer writing at home in his house in Princeton. The Kennan diary is valuable, I think, because it tells us about five important things. First, it illuminates the personal and intellectual life of America's most famous foreign policy strategist. Second, it reflects on recurring problems in American foreign policy. Third, the diary extending from 1916 to 2004. And Kennan, of course, lived from 1904 to 2005. He lived to be 101. The diary runs 88 years from 1916 to 2004. The diary instructs us on the changes in American society over those 88 years. Fourth, Kennan wrestled thoughtfully with basic human issues, such as the boundaries of love, responsibility, and one's relationship to God. And finally, in Kennan's recording of his physical, psychological, and intellectual decline near the end of his 101-year life, we vicariously experience the cruel process of dying as one's small gifts are taken away, little by little. His example suggests how each of us can, if we try hard enough, fade into history with dignity, as he certainly did. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I should warn you what the Kennan Diaries are not. They are not a full record of US life or of Kennan's life over that 88-year period. There are no entries, for example, indicating Kennan's reaction to the stock market crash of 1929, Pearl Harbor, the Kennedy assassination, or even 2001, 9/11. Kennan often went months without writing in the diary or simply writing mundane things such as the weather. Nor did he reveal big secrets about US foreign policy or about his personal life. Kennan remained the discreet diplomat. He would have been appalled at Edward Snowden. He fully expected his diary to be read by others, and he was determined to protect his privacy and that of his family and other intimates. Nevertheless, he was, despite some egregious blind spots, and Kennan did have some egregious blind spots in terms of his prejudices. Despite these blind spots, he was incredibly perceptive. He was often wise and far-seeing. And he wrote down, for the sake of posterity, much of what he saw and thought. Now, in my editing of the Kennan Diary for the book, the toughest part of that job was selecting from the 8,100 pages of the original, selecting what came to be 700 pages. And I can assure you that it was tough, but in selecting the entries for tonight's talk, I was rigorous and selecting down to what is going to be a manageable talk. I'm not going to discuss the 700 pages in their entirety, I can assure you. But I wanted to keep this talk short enough. Runs about 40 minutes. I wanted to keep it short enough so there's time for Q&A and for people to ask the questions that you are interested in and that I can try to answer. But what I've tried to do here is to give you a flavor of the diary at all the various stages of Kennan's life, from the 11-year-old boy to the centenarian. Okay, so I'm going to read some selections. Let's start with, this is Kennan at the age of 12. And the diary begins, it says, Diary of George Kennan. He wrote this, obviously, in longhand. Diary of George Kennan, 11 years old. Born February 16th, 1904. In this simple little book, a record of the day I cast, so I afterwards may look back upon my happy past. George Kennan, 11 years. Kennan grew up, here's a picture of his family. He grew up in Milwaukee in a bookish upper middle class family composed of his father, his stepmother, his 3 older sisters, and his younger half brother. And that's Kennan in the back row there, at the age of about 14. George's mother, Florence, had died when he was only 2 months old. Though Florence had succumbed to peritonitis from a burst appendix, her son grew up, for some reason, I'm not really sure why, but her son grew up believing that she had died giving birth to him. That guilt would help foster Kennan's lifelong melancholy. So he said he was a happy little boy at 11, but for much of his life after that, he doesn't sound very happy, as you'll see. Now I'm going to jump ahead to 1928. This is Kennan as a newly fledged diplomat, 1928. The date was May 6, 1928. Kennan was in Berlin. Now this is 5 years before the United States recognized the Bolshevik government, the communist government of the Soviet Union. But the US government believed that it would need to have Russian experts in the future. So the State Department started a program of extensive training and intensive training of a small group of Foreign Service officers who would learn Russian literature, Russian language, and Russian history. And they sent Kennan to Berlin for 3 years to master those subjects. So here's Kennan in 1928, writing, My window overlooks the square before the Schöneberg Rathaus. It is a great place for political demonstrations. Tonight, the roll of a drum calls attention to a demonstration coming across the square. It is no colorful, enthusiastic procession this time. It is instead a small group of the well-disciplined social democrats with 1 or 2 banners and a couple of squeaky instruments. They pass by my window, 4 abreast, women and men, shabbily dressed and unimposing. They are not the virile, overalled proletarians of the communist posters. I doubt, despite their professed socialism, whether they are members of the proletariat at all. They are more apt to be members of the great ragged overlap of the classes, the lower bourgeoisie, each with his few cents in the savings bank and his petty social ambitions. It is an unimpressive parade, and pathetic by virtue of its very unpretentiousness. Yet there is significance in this quietness and unpretentiousness, something stronger than in all the blaring and roaring of the communists and the fascists. These poor, voiceless people from the garrets of Berlin, they have carried the idealism of the German character through the horrors of war and revolution and economic collapse. And on their narrow shoulders rests the fate of future generations. Of course, this is 5 years before the Nazi takeover in Germany. Here's Kennan in November 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression. And Kennan, like many other people, many other thinking people during the Depression, came to the conclusion that capitalism as a system had failed, and that there was something basically wrong with the system, and it would not prevail in the future. So here's Kennan writing. He's still in Berlin, by the way. Has it never occurred to anyone to accept socialism in the economic sense without any of its political connotations? The capitalist countries have a choice. They can let their capitalistic economic structures work into such a chaos that it collapses of its own accord. This collapse would drag the cultural achievements of centuries down with it and succumb to a new middle age of Bolshevism, as our abandoned tropical plantation succumbs to the vegetation of the jungle. Or the capitalist countries can separate politics from economics, and their intelligent classes can put business life on a socialist basis from above, without turning political power over to the proletariat, as of course it happened in the Soviet Union, at least theoretically. If the intelligent classes in these countries, meaning Western Europe, if the intelligent classes in these countries haven't enough force and stamina to do this, then Western European civilization is already dead and gone, and there is no hope. Okay, we're jumping ahead here to December 20th, 1933. This is right at the moment when Kennan enters the Soviet Union for the first time as the principal assistant of the American ambassador, the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union, William Bullitt. Now, the entry is dated December 20th. Kennan is talking here about the events of 10 days earlier, December 10th, 1933. The train bearing the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union crossed the Polish-Soviet border in the early twilight of a late December afternoon. The deserted forest of the border zone crowded the single tracks on either side, silent, snow-covered, and forbidding. Next to the barbed wire stood a lone wooden sentry tower in a clearing, and on top of it was the dim figure of a Polish soldier with a gun and fixed bayonet, and his greatcoat turned up against the intense cold, back in the days before global warming. A short distance beyond the border, the train slowed down at a little cottage besides the tracks, and the Soviet border guards with their long, snug overcoats and the blue caps of the secret police came on board. A few minutes later, there were lights and voices outside the windows, and the train pulled up to the station. People crowded round. A dapper little individual who turned out to be the Foreign Office's agent in Minsk and who had been sent down to the border for the occasion pushed his way through to the ambassador's compartment and delivered a ceremonious little speech of welcome. And then Kennan goes on, I sat up nearly that whole first night looking out the train window. To me, this first contact with the Soviet Union has an exceptional meaning. I had spent 5 years in intensive preparation for it. I had a greater command of the Russian language than I had ever encountered in any foreigner born and bred outside Russia. I had a knowledge of Russian history and literature equivalent to that of the average educated Russian of the old school, meaning the Tsarist times, and considerably better than that of the average product of Soviet education. Finally, I had spent the last 2 years compiling and analyzing Soviet economic statistics as a principal occupation, for the State Department, and collecting materials for a biography of Anton Chekhov as a hobby. The result was a consuming curiosity about all things Russian and an intense excitement at the first actual contact with the Soviet world. I'm going to jump ahead 7 years to June 14th, 1940. Now, this is the period, June 1940, when the United States was still neutral in World War II. The war had begun in Europe in 1939, and Germany had invaded France and Holland and Scandinavia in June 1940, and I think France actually surrendered on June 14th. So this is Kennan. Kennan was working in the American Embassy in Berlin, and he's on a train, and he writes this: left Berlin shortly before 1 o'clock on the new express train to The Hague. Prisoners, probably Polish, were working on the fields between Berlin and Hanover. The sun beat hard on the flat, treeless fields, and the armed guards kept the prisoners lined up in neat Germanic rows. Beyond Hanover, we began to encounter long trains of boxcars with fresh prisoners from the west. The only openings for light and air were little apertures cut high up near the ends of the cars. And through these one could see the crowded heads, the pale faces, and the bewildered eyes which stared, full of boredom and homesickness, out over the cold severity of the North German plain. I looked at these and at the peasant women in the fields and at the well-ordered railway yards, and I fell to reflecting that whereas at one time, when individual conviction and determination played the decisive part in warfare, then it was the free people who made the better soldiers. But now, in the age of the machine, the slave peoples had the advantage, for it was the machine that counted. And the machine, in contrast to the sword, was best served by slaves. In June 1944, the same month as the D-Day invasion of Normandy, Kennan was working in the American Embassy in London. And in June, he was named as the #2, the chief assistant to the American ambassador to Russia, Averell Harriman. So in going from London to Moscow, Kennan had to go all the way around the great bulk of Europe, since the Germans still held almost all that territory. So by military transport, Kennan flew from London to Italy, to Egypt, to Iraq, to Iran, and then to Russia. And on the end of June 23rd and 23rd to the 25th of June, he spent those days in Baghdad and wrote a few days later. And I think it's a very interesting entry. The chief impression of Baghdad, and of course, at that point, Iraq was kind of a British mandate, or basically a British colony. The chief impression of Baghdad in the summer, which I carried away from those 3 days there, was one of claustrophobia. All day we were barricaded in the embassy. Inside the embassy, the temperature never fell below 90, but it was even hotter outside. We might look out the window, as one looks out the window in zero weather in northern countries, and see the burning, dusty wind tearing at the eucalyptus trees, and the flat, bleached country enveloped in the colorless sunshine of the desert, a sunshine with no nuances, no shades, no shadows, a sunshine which does not even brown the skin, but only strikes and penetrates and dissolves with its unbending, hostile power. Into this inferno of heat, only mad dogs and Englishmen, as Noel Coward used to sing, could dream of entering. Then he writes, what of the possibilities for America in Baghdad? Iraq is a country in which man's selfishness and stupidity have ruined almost all the natural productivity, where vegetation can survive only along the banks of the great rivers which traverse its deserts, where climate has become unfavorable to human health and vigor. This is a population unhygienic in its habits, sorely weakened and debilitated by disease, inclined to all manner of religious bigotry and fanaticism, and condemned by the tenets of Islam to keep a full half of the population, namely the feminine half, confined and excluded from the productive efforts of society by a system of indefinite house arrest. This people has now come into just enough contact with Western life so that its upper class has a thirst for many things which can be obtained only in the West. Suspicious and resentful of the British, they would be glad to obtain these things from us. They would be glad to use us as a foil for the British, as an escape from the restraints which the British place upon them. If we give them these things, if we give them this aid, we can perhaps enjoy a momentary favor on the part of those interested in receiving them. But to the extent that we aid them, we weaken British influence, and we acquire, whether we wish it or not, responsibility for the actions of the Iraqis. If they then begin to do things which are not in our interests, which affect the world situation in ways unfavorably to our security, and if the British are unable to restrain them, we then have ourselves, at least in part, to blame. And then it is up to us to take the appropriate measures. Are we willing to bear this responsibility? I know, and every realistic American knows, that we are not. Our government is technically incapable of conceiving and promulgating a long-term consistent policy toward areas remote from its own territory. Our actions in the field of foreign affairs are the convulsive reactions of politicians to an internal political life dominated by vocal minorities. Those few Americans who remember something of the pioneer life of their own country will find it hard to view the deserts of Iraq without a pang of interest and excitement as to the possibilities for reclamation and economic development. If trees once grew here, could they not grow here again? If rains once fell, could they not again be attracted from the inexhaustible resources of nature? Could not climate be altered, disease eradicated? If they're seeking to escape from reality, such Americans may even pursue these dreams and enter upon the long and stony road which would lead to their fruition. But if they're willing to recall the sad state of soil conservation in their own country and the vast amount of social improvement to be accomplished at home, and the inevitable limitations on the efficacy of our type of democracy in the field of foreign affairs, then they will restrain their excitement at the silent, expectant possibilities of the Iraqi desert and will return, like disappointed but dutiful children, to the sad deficiencies and problems of their native land. Here's Kennan in Leningrad in 1945, September 1945. I'd been in Leningrad just 3 days of my life, and yet it was like coming home. I had read so much about it, and through the years I had spent in the Baltic states, I had come to love the flat horizons of the north, the strange slanting light, the wintry bleakness of nature, and the consequent accentuation of all that is warm and rich in human relationships. This is to me one of the most poignant communities of the world, a great sad city where the spark of human genius has always had to penetrate the darkness, the dampness, and the cold in order to make its light felt, and it has acquired, that is the human spirit, has acquired for that very reason a strange warmth, a strange intensity, a strange beauty. I know that in this city, where I have never lived, there's nevertheless, by some strange quirk of fate, a previous life perhaps, been deposited a portion of my own capacity to feel and love, a portion, in other words, of my own life, and that this is something which no American will ever understand and no Russian ever believe. Oh, we have to, I'm sorry, we can advance here. We can see some, here's Kennan in Russia. Okay, Kennan and his wife Annalisa, and their daughter Grace, not very happy about being there. And there's Kennan in Berlin in 1940. And here's Kennan, we're at the right point here. Here's Kennan at his desk in the State Department. So this is something that I wrote at the beginning of the chapter in 1948. It's kind of background. Despite his standing, 1948, despite his standing as America's premier strategist of the Cold War, Kennan in 1948 began diverging from the Truman administration's policy. In 1947, he had quietly criticized the global reach of the Truman Doctrine. Far better, he had thought, was to focus on aid only to Greece and Turkey rather than to promise aid to the entire world. Though Kennan advocated covert operations and black propaganda in Eastern Europe in carefully controlled situations, Kennan also saw the Cold War as a limited engagement. Confrontation with Moscow, he believed, should be political rather than military. This is a point that Adam made in his recent paper. And confrontation should also be avoided in areas that Kennan regarded as of marginal importance, such as China or Vietnam. Moreover, Kennan suggested in February 1948 that with the recovery already underway in Western Europe, this time might soon be ripe for serious negotiations with Moscow. In describing the diplomat best suited to conduct such negotiations, Kennan, in effect, nominated himself. In sum, while most officials in Washington and in Moscow in 1948 were escalating the conflict, Kennan, although still very much a Cold Warrior, was also beginning to look for ways to ease tensions. And that would remain a concern of his for the rest of his life, really. And I think one reason why Kennan was so concerned with easing tensions is that as time went on, he became more and more concerned and more worried about the prospect of a third world war. I think one of the turning points for him in terms of this growing apprehension was going to Hamburg in May 1949. The Hamburg, Germany had been a favorite city of Kennan. He had often gone there on vacation in the interwar years. And of course, those of you who know World War II history know that Hamburg was firebombed, was destroyed, basically almost all of it destroyed in Allied bombing that was intended to ignite massive fires, which destroyed most of the city. So Kennan wrote here, in firebombed Hamburg, for the first time, I felt an unshakable conviction that no military advantage could have justified this stupendous, careless destruction of civilian life and of material values built up laboriously by human hands over the course of centuries for purposes having nothing to do with war. Least of all could it have been justified by the screaming non sequitur, "They did it to us." And it suddenly appeared to me that in these ruins there was an unanswerable symbolism which we in the West could not afford to ignore. If the Western world was really going to make valid the pretense of having a higher moral plane, of having greater sympathy and understanding for the human being as God made him, then the West has to learn to fight its wars morally as well as militarily, or not fight them at all. For moral principles were a part of its strength. Shorn of this strength, the West was no longer itself. Its victories were not real victories. And the best it could accomplish in the long run would be to pull down the temple over its own head. The military would stamp this idea as naive and would say that war is war, and that where you're in it, you have to fight with every means you have, or go down in defeat. But if that is the case, then there rests upon Western civilization, bitter as this may be, the obligation to be militarily stronger than its adversaries by a margin sufficient to enable the West to dispense, in other words, to not use, those means of war which can stave off defeat only at the cost of undermining the value of victory. In other words, the West should have such a margin of military superiority that it could afford not to use the most horrible weapons which would gain a victory, but also undermine the moral standing of the West. Here's Kennan with talking about President, well, we don't have a picture. We don't have any pictures or at least I don't have any pictures of Kennan with President Truman, but I thought I had to talk about President Truman a little bit since, of course, independence is so close by. But here's a picture of Kennan meeting with the other members of the policy planning staff in their offices in the State Department. Kennan, of course, is at the at the head of the table. Notice there are no women in the room. This is September 26, 1949. This morning at 12:30, Mr. Webb took me to see the president, ostensibly to report to him on the progress of our negotiations on atomic energy. The president looked slightly tired, but was his usual likable self. I could understand how such strong loyalties could develop between him and his associates. I was glad upon reflection that I had had so little contact with him, for I would not like to be in a position where personal loyalty and affection forced me to close my eyes to the obvious deficiencies in the conduct of foreign policy in this administration. And I would not like to have to profess enthusiasm for a confusing and ineffective method of operation. Here's Kennan talking with another president, actually I think the president he admired most, I think you could say this, and that's John F. Kennedy. Here's Kennan speaking with Kennedy 10 days before Kennedy was inaugurated. So this is January 10th, 1961. President-elect Kennedy had asked Kennan to fly with him from LaGuardia Airport in New York down to Washington, and they would talk, take advantage of that time to discuss some issues. After poking around some, I found Mr. Kennedy's plane, went on board, and read newspapers until he arrived. After the takeoff, he came into the main compartment, sat down next to me, ordered lunch, and talked with me all the way to Washington. He began by telling me of the many approaches made to him from the Soviet side, particularly through the Soviet ambassador. He asked why I thought Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, why I thought Khrushchev was so eager for a summit meeting. I said that I felt that Khrushchev's position had been weakened and explained why I thought that was the case. I thought there was a real sense of urgency in Moscow about achieving agreement on disarmament, and that this stemmed largely from concern over nuclear proliferation, in other words, other nations obtaining nuclear weapons, particularly China. Khrushchev, I thought, still hoped that by the insertion of his own personality and the use of his powers of persuasion, he could achieve an agreement with the United States and recoup in this way his failing political fortunes. Moving ahead here to March 21st, 1977. Now, this shows an unhappy Kennan, and I think it's appropriate for what I'm going to be reading. Now, George F. Kennan was a pioneering environmentalist. He cared a lot about the environment. From the 1930s on, his diary is filled with many laments about pollution. That was something he's very, very concerned with. And he believed it quite strongly, as you'll see in this entry and in another one that I'll read in a few minutes. He wrote on March 21st, 1977, "Modern urban industrial man is given to the raping of anything and everything natural in which he can fasten his talents. He rapes the sea, he rapes the soil, he rapes the natural resources of the earth, he rapes the atmosphere. He rapes the future of his own civilization instead of living off nature's surplus, which he ought to do. Instead, he lives off its substance. He would not need to do this were he less numerous and were he content to live a more simple life. But he is prepared neither to reduce his numbers nor to lead a simpler and more healthful life. So he goes on destroying his own environment like a vast horde of locusts, and he must be expected, persisting blindly as he does in this depraved process, to put an end to his own existence within the next century. The years 2000 to 2050 should witness, in fact, the end of the great Western civilization. The Chinese, more prudent, may well inherit the ruins." Here's Kennan, not on the environment, that's coming a little bit later. Here's Kennan, February 23rd, 1979, in the middle of the Carter administration. "Dramatic and somewhat menacing events in international affairs. The attack on our embassy in Tehran, the murder of our ambassador in Afghanistan, some things never change, the Chinese attack on Vietnam, the beginning of a new price rise and shortage of oil. In the face of all of this, our government has behaved in accordance with the worst traditions of American statesmanship, concerned almost exclusively with congressional opinion rather than with the external effects of its actions. There's been a great deal of verbal flexing of the muscles and militant bravado, all of it directed exclusively to the internal audience and to hell with its effects abroad. And one day we issued thunderous warnings to the Russians not to attack Saudi Arabia, which the Russians had never even dreamed of doing, and to the Chinese not to attack Taiwan, which was equally far from their thoughts. Since then, we have also sternly warned the Russians not to intervene in Iran, which we ourselves have been doing for a full 2 decades. In all these cases, we have allowed it to be inferred that if our wishes were not obeyed, we would use force, although in not one of these situations would our military force be the answer to the problem, even if we had more than the odd 20 divisions that we now have. Move ahead here to a somewhat happier Kennan. There's Kennan playing the guitar, which he taught himself. He's actually quite musical aptitude, and that's Eric Severide, those who remember Eric Severide, who was a friend of Kennan. In the 1980s, Kennan's critique of US policies, particularly regarding nuclear weapons, particularly regarding the accelerating nuclear arms race of the 1980s, early 80s, and mid-80s, would gain a wider public hearing. Once more, he commanded a voice in the national conversation. His stature as a respected man of conscience did not, however, yield the influence in governmental policy that he so earnestly sought. Although he dreaded the prospect of a nuclear catastrophe, a part of him also welcomed the possibility of cleansing the planet of what he regarded as human despoilment. And we should probably go back to this sad Kennan for this. This is April 5th, 1980. I am sick in the consciousness of what awaits my poor children and grandchildren, but otherwise, viewing it from the broader standpoint, I long for the day of the nuclear catastrophe, in order that the nature of these lovely continents, Europe and North America, now savaged and despoiled by overpopulation and commercialism, may have a chance to breathe, to recover, to cause these atrocities of human handiwork to decay into the ruins they deserve to become. And thus to restore to the trees, the natural shrubs, the streams and wetlands, and the non-destructive animals, the dominion over God's great and beautiful creation, which they deserve to have. Here's Kennan in 1981. He had just won the Einstein Peace Prize, and this is April 27th, 1981. The newspapers tell us of President Reagan's speech at West Point. It is a simple world picture that he paints, and a very old-fashioned one. It is so old-fashioned that I ought to love it, as he sees it, and be thrilled by it. I cannot. I love certain old-fashioned values and concepts, but not his. And his was underlined. He stresses the need for a revival of patriotism. I can imagine that were we ever to meet and talk face to face, something which is most unlikely to occur and never did occur, he might, remembering my evil reputation, look me sternly in the eye and ask, "Kennan, are you patriotic?" What could I say in reply? I would have to ask in turn, do you mean, do I love my country? And if so, what do you mean by country? The land or the people? If you mean the land, then yes, of course I love it. Loved it as a child, the way it was then. Continue to love it today to the extent the people have not yet made a wasteland, a garbage dump, or a sewer out of it. If you and your supporters, who seem to have a positive hatred of all that is natural and beautiful in the land, complete the destruction of it, or encourage the developers to complete that destruction, there will be little of it to love. And the people? What do you mean, love people? I suspect that you mean, when you speak of patriotism, do I join you in idealizing them, in encouraging in myself and in others the view that there is something wonderful about them, something other people do not have, something that gives them a superior virtue and strength and entitles them to consider themselves leaders in the world, stronger and with greater authority than anyone else. That's, in other words, American exceptionalism. If this is the way the question is put, the answer is decidedly no. Now here's Kennan, August 5th, 1987, talking about Mikhail Gorbachev. 2 years earlier, in 1985, Gorbachev had come to leadership in the Soviet Union and, of course, instituted great changes, trying to reform Soviet society with glasnost and perestroika. Kennan wrote, Gorbachev is a remarkable man, so remarkable as to be almost inexplicable in terms of his own known professional background. What he set out to do, as he saw it, was no doubt to liberate Soviet society and the Soviet economy from the ill effects of the ongoing traces of Stalinist terrorism on the one hand and the corrupting system of privilege on the other, by which the aging Brezhnev and his cronies contrived to hold things together for so many years. But these evils have bitten deeply into the fabric of Soviet society and have mingled and partially fused there with certain of the great distortions brought into the life of the Russian Empire by the Communist Revolution of 1917. It is this, in essence, that Gorbachev is running up against, whether he realizes it or not, as he sets out to correct what he sees as the enduring evils of Stalinism and Brezhnevism in Russian life. He probably thinks this is all he has to correct, but he may find, before he is finished, that in some respects, he has to correct the mistakes and the blind spots of the Bolshevik seizures of power in 1917, and even take upon his own shoulders some of the unfinished business of the old Tsarist regime. Russia has no lack of past follies that cry out for correction, and will require correction if Gorbachev is to make out of Russian society what he would like to make out of it. In the 1990s, of course, Kennan in 1990 was 86. In the 1990s, Kennan criticized the first, the Gulf War, the war against Iraq, as unnecessary and as diverting resources and attention away from the rehabilitation of America's domestic infrastructure and American finances. Nevertheless, he was impressed with the spectacle of U.S. military might. Contrary to what one might expect, he said little about the final collapse of the Soviet Union. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Now here's Kennan in 1997. He's now 93, and that's how that picture was taken. He's now 93 years old. This is 1997, and that's how he looked at the age of 93. He's looking outside the window of his office at the Institute for Advanced Study. Kennan regarded the extension of NATO to the borders of Russia as a short-sighted policy that would poison relations in the long run. Although he succeeded in helping stir up opposition to this policy, the Clinton administration went ahead anyway. So here's Kennan, January 4th, 1997. That the Russians will not react wisely and moderately to the decision of NATO to extend its boundaries to the Russian frontiers is clear. I would expect a strong militarization of Russian political life, to the tune of a great deal of hysterical exaggeration of the danger and a falling back into the time-honored vision of Russia as the innocent object of the aggressive lusts of a wicked and heretical world environment. There will be efforts by the Russian leadership to persuade its neighbors to transform their relationship with Russia into one of an out-and-out military alliance, and to develop much closer relations with Iran and China, all of which, of course, is happening now, with a view to forming a strongly anti-Western military bloc as a counterweight to a NATO pressing for world domination, as the Russians will see it. Thus will develop a wholly and even tragically unnecessary division between East and West, and, in effect, a renewal of the Cold War. This is Christmas Day, 1999. Kennan was now 95. He was still writing op-ed pieces in the New York Times, still giving some lectures, and in fact, still next year wrote published a small book, A History of the Kennan Family, which he had researched in many small archives across New York and New England and other states. But he writes, the unquestionable decline of my own powers, partly intellectual powers, but beyond that, going into the personal, the inability to confront the small distractions of life, the decline of memory, and the limit of concentration. I see myself surrounded in this house by great piles of demands upon me, demands that I don't see in myself the power to cope with. Many of these arise from expectations encouraged by things I have done in the past, coming from people who have no idea of the inner frailties of old age. I am, in this sense, the victim of my own past. The lesson of all this, I am sure, is that I have lived too long, have outlived myself. I have no defense against the refrain flung at me by so many, you look all right. I try in the face of all of this to do my best, but it is not good enough. And awareness of that inadequacy is what weighs most heavily upon me. Here's November 21st, 2001. Now, there's no entry after 9/11, but here's November 21st, 2001. And this is what you already heard, but I'll read it again anyway. Regarding the war in Afghanistan, I find myself more of an isolationist than ever, reflecting that we, as soon as we can detach ourselves from this mess, should concentrate our efforts on developing at home alternatives to the importation of Middle Eastern oil, particularly oil from Saudi Arabia. We should do this in place of further efforts to play a role in the Middle East. This is March 18th, 2003. The launching of the war in Iraq, the first firing in cold blood, is now, the president has told us, only some 36 hours off. And then later that year, December 2003, Kennan is now close to 100 years old. He's 99, going on 100. And he wrote December 17th. I have lived through the most terrible night in memory, its agony sharpened by extreme dizziness and weakness, which have frustrated several efforts to get into a standing position. Then he says, what can I do? Give up? No. Then there's nothing left to do. No, give up? No. Then there's nothing left but the end. So struggle along, struggle along. And here's the final image. This is the Kennan Diary, the last page of the Kennan Diary where he really couldn't write. He really could not write. Kennan in his last year could not write in the diary. A friend saw him near the end. His head, resting on a pillow, now had a skeletal beauty. He could speak only a little, forcing out a few words with increasing difficulty. He died peacefully at home on March 17th, 2005, 1 year, 1 month, and 1 day after his 100th birthday. So ended the journal begun by the 11-year-old. In this simple little book, a record of the day I cast. So I afterwards may look back upon my happy past. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
May need to repeat the question, too.
Pardon? Oh, sure, yeah.
Could you go into a little more detail about his relationship with Kennedy, with John Kennedy, and how he felt about Kennedy's policies?
Okay, his relationship with Kennedy. I think we have to acknowledge, Kennan was vain. He was vain. And one of the reasons he appreciated John Kennedy is that Kennedy showed great attention to Kennan, great respect for Kennan. At a time when Kennan, as I referred to, basically had been fired by John Foster Dulles in the previous administration, Kennedy, as a senator, showed respect for Kennan and brought Kennan into the administration, appointed him ambassador to Yugoslavia, rescued Kennan from just a scholarly life. And Kennan was thrilled about being back in government. Kennan thought most of Kennedy's policies were sound, sensible. He was an admirer of Kennedy and was personally very distraught at the Kennedy assassination. Yeah.
Did Kennan have anything to say about, particularly in 47 and 48, about the partitioning of Palestine, the creation of
Right. Now, one thing I should say, I said that the diary is not lots of things,
Yeah.
and one of the things it's not is something that gives us a good picture of Kennan's views, although there are other sources but Kennan's views on this. But the diary does not give us a good picture of Kennan's views from 1946 and 47 and early 48, the time of his maximum influence. In fact, the diary for 1947, this is a guy who could write pages and pages describing the birds he saw. But the diary for 1947, which is his single year of greatest influence, is one single page, and it's verse. It's like a poem. But Kennan spoke out elsewhere, and he thought it was a mistake. He thought it was a mistake for the United States to commit to a Jewish state in part of Palestine, which became Israel. Like many people in the State Department, he thought that would set up the United States for long-term problems. And in later years after, the years after 1948, the creation of Israel, Kennan would often in the diary say, basically, I told you so, when there's problem after problem in the Middle East. He thought that was not in America's national interest. And I mean, one of the reasons that President Truman was obviously moved by the Holocaust and so forth, but President Truman was also interested in getting elected in his own right later on in 1948. And that's where Kennan despised the idea of domestic politics influencing foreign policy. He was unrealistic in that way. There's a democracy. But Kennan thought foreign policy should be based on objective national interests. Yeah.
What were his views on Hitler and the Nazis before they took power?
Well, what was his views on Hitler and the Nazis before they took power? He regarded Hitler as dangerous, particularly when Hitler began to move onto other countries and to violate the Versailles Treaty. In fact, something I just came across yesterday at the Truman Library was a diary entry from a friend of Kennan who actually said that Kennan in 1936, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, Abyssinia, Ethiopia, Kennan thought the United States should have taken a much stronger stand against the fascists then. So he was certainly, disapproving of Hitler. That's an understatement. That's an understatement. Yeah.
With Kennan's strong worldview, did he ever consider running for public office?
Yes, actually, consider somebody who despised democracy, or not despised, that's too strong, but thought democracy was overrated as a system of government. He did. He thought of running for the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania. He talks about this in his memoirs. And he thought about running actually for senator from New Jersey and entertained that idea. And he went, this is in the late 1950s, and he went to talk to the director at the Institute for Advanced Study and asked if he could get a leave of absence with pay so that he could campaign. And the director said no. The terms of his professorship there was that he would have to be a scholar and he couldn't be running for office. So that was one of the main reasons he abandoned that idea. But he thought highly of himself and thought that he would be, make a good, it's an oxymoron. Kennan, as a politician, is kind of an oxymoron. But he didn't see it that way. Yeah.
Why did John Foster Dulles fire?
Why did John Foster Dulles fire? I mean, that's a little overstated, but basically. Kennan was appointed ambassador to Moscow in the last months of the Truman administration. Kennan actually expected, and this is a story which I'm writing now, and it's largely unknown story. Kennan actually expected that he would make such a splash as ambassador, that he would be able to institute, at a time of great tension between the United States and Russia, that he would be able to open up a dialogue with the Soviets, and that the next administration coming in, we went there in May '52, new administration would be coming in January '53. Kennan expected that when the new administration came in, that Kennan having opened a dialogue with the Soviets, he would then basically force the hand of the new administration, whether it was Democratic or Republican, to keep him in Moscow. And he would then be able to further negotiate what hopefully would become détente. But that failed miserably for all kinds of reasons, and Kennan succeeded not in opening negotiations with the Russians, but in angering them, and they kicked him out of the country, declared him persona non grata, which means he was not allowed to enter the country. Anyway, it's a long story, but he was not allowed to re-enter the Soviet Union, the only American ambassador ever so expelled in the whole US-Russian, US-Soviet history. So Dulles saw him as basically a screw-up. And so the new administration came in January '53, and Kennan still expected that he would be appointed to some high position in the administration, maybe not ambassador, but some high position. And Dulles basically left Kennan hanging, twisting in the wind. Didn't appoint him to any position and didn't let him know that he was not going to be appointed. So Kennan was literally on tenterhooks waiting for the phone to ring. All his friends were appointed to positions and he was not hearing anything. He was in absolute agony. So Dulles was really turning the knife. And finally, Dulles called him in to the State Department in like April or so, 1953, and said he was sorry, but there was no niche for Kennan in the administration. So here's a guy who's supposed to be the most famous strategist of American foreign policy, and there's no niche for him. There's another aspect of that, and that is that when the Republicans, particularly Dulles was speaking on behalf of Eisenhower, when the Republicans were running for president in 1952, similar to elections now, each was trying to the Democrats and Republicans were each trying to outcompete each other as to how tough they could be against the communists. And Kennan was known as the father of the containment doctrine to contain Soviet power. Dulles said that wasn't good enough. We wanted to liberate, roll back communist power in Eastern Europe. And of course, Dulles had no way of doing that. When the Hungarian revolt started in 1956, the Eisenhower administration did nothing because rolling back Soviet power would have meant war, and nobody wanted that. But still, that's another aspect that Kennan was known as the father of containment, and Dulles wanted to be even, at least publicly, known for being even tougher than the advocates of containment. Yeah?
As the Cold War went on, U.S. began advocating for neoliberalism, as shown especially when we ousted the democratically elected Allende government in Chile and installed Augusto Pinochet. How do you think Kennan, or if you know, how did Kennan really respond to this progression of the more neoliberal foreign and economic policies in trying to overthrow the Soviet Union and through neoliberal shock doctrine tactics?
Well, he never referred to that in particular, but I think Kennan felt that in general, Kennan, I think that very telling entry about Baghdad, Kennan was skeptical about the ability of Americans and the ability of U.S. foreign policy to use American power overseas as a surgeon uses a scalpel. In other words, to overthrow other governments or to use military force skillfully. He thought the Americans were generally not very capable in that direction. And so Ken sometimes called himself an isolationist. I don't think he was quite an isolationist, but he was against that kind of overthrow of other governments. He thought that was a mistake and counterproductive, and thought it only increase the resistance of the Soviet government to change. Yeah.
How did Kennan feel about the slow approach to interfering in Europe in World War II and going against Germany and the Nazis?
How did he feel about the delay in
our slow entry into the war?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. About that. I mean, I'm trying to think. You're talking about the delay in the Second Front, or before Pearl Harbor, the 2 years, the 2 years before the German invasion
the attack on
and Pearl Harbor.
The Neutrality Act,
Right.
the destroyer deal.
Frankly, that's a very good question. I don't think I have an answer. Kennan, during those years, was in the Berlin embassy, American embassy in Berlin, and mostly taking care of administrative matters. And I don't know from letters. I mean, that's a very good question, but I'm not, nothing comes to mind that I've seen with regard to that. Yeah.
Do you know what his IQ was?
No, but he was very smart. I mean, he certainly was smart. I mean, one aspect of that is languages, right? So he had spent some time in Germany as a boy, a year in Germany as a boy, and he spoke German. I mean, he also studied it after, but he spoke German flawlessly, so well. And he wrote German. I mean, there are pages and pages of diary written in German, the pages written in Russian as well. But he mastered the German language so well that in passing, he criticized the style of other German writers, okay? So Germany had learned, in part, as a boy, 8-year-old boy. And as you know, it's easier to learn languages when you're younger. He didn't start learning Russian until he was in his mid-20s and mastered Russian so well that he could blend into the population, speaking without a trace of an accent. I mean, people famously said that he spoke better Russian than Stalin. That is not saying much, since Stalin was Georgian and spoke it with a heavy Russian accent. Spoke Russian with a heavy Georgian accent. But no, he spoke flawless. Right, I mean, Russians commented on his ability with Russian.
I have another thing very quickly.
Pardon?
I wrote to Mr. Kennan many years ago, and I never heard from him, and I ran into a...
Well, then he's not as smart as we think he is.
And I ran into a friend of his, and he said that was unusual.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, so he was a people person?
No, I don't think he's a people, but he had a strong sense of obligation. When he talked at the last entry, all the things on his desk, he would generally answer letters. And people sent him manuscripts. He would generally read them and write detailed comments. He had a very strong sense of obligation. Just one final thing about the language. He became ambassador to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, from 61 to 63. And I understand that Serbo-Croatian is significantly different from Russian. But he mastered Serbo-Croatian sufficiently well to give a public lecture in it. He also had Norwegian. His wife's family is from Norway, spoke some French. So, incredible language ability.
Maybe one last question.
Okay, one good one. Okay.
I'd like to elaborate on the earlier gentleman's question concerning neoliberalism. My apologies. I'd like to elaborate on the earlier gentleman's question concerning neoliberalism in the 70s. You mentioned the falling out with the Dole brothers. Of course, John Foster's brother, Alan Dole, was the head of the CIA in his early years. Do you know much about his attitudes towards CIA intervention in Iran in '53, Guatemala in '54, as far as also George Kennan's expressed support for CIA covert activities in Western Europe against left-wing governments? Do you know much about that?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned in the one of my comments, Kennan helped direct covert activities in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe in the 1940s. He also later said that had been the greatest mistake of his governmental career. But you have to understand here what he meant. What the kind of covert activities in Western Europe was aid to funneling money to non-communist labor unions, funneling money to often socialist but non-communist political parties. In Eastern Europe, it was aid to refugee groups or groups who might spy on the Soviet government. He later said that was a mistake. With regard to Iran, I think you have to say one of the blind spots that Kennan had was that I think he had, it's not unfair to say this, contempt for many people we say third world people. And I think that, in fact, with regard to Iran, Kennan thought what we should have done with Iran was what we, meaning the British and Americans, should have done was to hold on to the oil properties. And the same thing with the oil properties of Saudi Arabia, the oil wells in Saudi Arabia and what's today the United Arab Emirates and so forth, and just hold them by military force. That those resources really didn't belong to those people because the people living there because they really couldn't use them. It was Western technology which had developed them and they should belong to the West. So I don't know in particular what he felt about the overthrow of Mossadegh, but he, thought basically something like that was okay if it was done without too much force. Okay. Thank you.
You sign books.
Oh, yeah, sure.